Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Macrino. I'm the principal of Oswegatchie School in Waterford, Connecticut. I'm a member of the CAS Education Equity Committee, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to our breakout session, The Incompatibility of DEI and Anti-Racism. This topic is critically important as we dive more deeply and explore how we can work together to learn and lead for systemic racial and social justice. Thank you so much for attending this session and joining us today. I want to begin by recognizing and thanking our education partners, the Connecticut Department of Education and SERC, for their generous support in helping us to make this Education Equity Summit possible. And now just a couple of quick reminders. Everyone has been muted. If possible, please turn on your video as it's nice to be able to see everyone. Please ask questions in the chat or raise your hand with the button at the bottom of the screen to be recognized by the presenter if you would like to speak. We'll do our best to answer your questions during this webinar. As we're seeing, they go by quite quickly. Along with asking questions in the chat, please use the chat to share ideas and let us know if you experience technical problems during this Zoom meeting, as we will be monitoring the chat. This webinar is being recorded and we will be posted on the CAS website. You will receive a notification email as soon as all of the sessions from today are available. Please feel free to view this session and the rest of the summit sessions at your leisure and share them with your colleagues and friends. Our hope is that you will find them useful for professional learning within your school community during the coming school year. And now here comes the good stuff. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter for this session, Linda T. Darcy. Linda Darcy is the Director of the Office of Teaching and Learning at the Learn Regional Education Service Center. As a resident of Rockfall, Connecticut, Ms. Darcy is an educator, presenter, and keynote speaker. She spent 16 years as a secondary world language teacher in the Hartford region. With a primary focus on teacher professional learning, Ms. Darcy also served in several leadership positions, most recently with the Capital Region Education Council, CREC Resource Group. Her areas of expertise include diversity and equity, culturally relevant pedagogy, curriculum and instructional design, English learners, and social emotional learning. Please join me in welcoming Linda Darcy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. I am going to immediately start sharing because, as Rosie said, the time goes by fast. And while I'm doing that, what I would love is if you would use the chat to introduce yourselves, your district, your role, and in a nutshell, why you chose to attend this session. So while you're doing that, I will just mention that I will be sharing a PDF version of the presentation so that everything that I have, like some of the videos or articles, everything will be linked in it. I can't get rid of my my middle school teacherness, and I don't like sharing it first. Not that there's any big mystery, but I will be sharing it at the end. And you'll notice that I plaster my email on everything, because the more emails I get, the more important I feel. So I would love for you to reach out. I have the benefit of time to research. So if you're looking for some kind of resource, I may already have it at my fingertips, and I'm more than happy to share that with you. So that is that introductory slide. And then I also want to thank, SERC, CAS, and the State Department of Education for having this summit and for inviting me to present. And of course, I especially want to thank Miguel for being my opening act this morning. It was very kind of him. So I do want to start with a land acknowledgement. We begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. an abbreviated version of norms that are kind of set out by Glenn Singleton, borrowed heavily. But as we engage in small group conversations and engage in this presentation, there's a few things to keep in mind. The first one is be willing to be surprised. I always talk about going to a Marvel movie and having willing suspension of disbelief, and to just, set aside any cognitive dissonance that you may have for the next hour and be willing to let new information in. Speak your truth, which is twofold. Number one, not simply we want you to participate and we want you to talk, but the other piece is to make sure that you're grounding anything that you have to say in your own experience. So we want to speak from our own frame of reference rather than saying something like, well, my best friend's brother-in-law's cousin's sister is gay and she says, right? We'll just ground everything in our own experience. Expect and accept non-closure. There are no easy answers. There are very few hard answers. And we're not going to be able to solve racism in 60 minutes. What I hope to do is kind of give you something to think about as you all as leaders go through the work of building equity into your school or district or classroom. And then finally, lean into the discomfort. The learning begins at the end of your comfort zone, but I also want to encourage everyone to practice self-care, because something that we may be talking about could be triggering. And so we kind of look at different people's involvement. Everyone will be engaged at the level to which they can. Everyone will learn, everyone will move forward. It just may look differently for everybody. As Joe already mentioned, please use the chat and the raise your hand feature. We're actually a small enough group that please feel free, if you have a burning desire to talk, to interject. I've taught middle school for years. It's hard to throw me off my game. So I look forward to some of the interaction. As any teacher would, I have overplanned, but I am also very well aware I would like this to take on the flavor that you want. So if we head off in a different direction, that's great. It's the conversation that's important. So for my objectives and to share my objectives and what hopefully everyone's on board for is really twofold. One is to kind of look at and talk about why is it important to center race when we're talking about equity in education, and then explore how DEI and the DEI movement threatens to dilute the power of anti-racism. I want to recognize that, Evie, it must be surprising to hear me talk like this after some of our sitting around the table kind of talking about anti-racism versus DEI, and look where I ended up. So I think it's important, especially as a white woman, to set myself in context. And so in order to do that, I'm going to give a real quick synopsis of how I came to this work. I did grow up in Connecticut. I grew up in North Granby, very small town, more cows than people in 1980. So it was a very insular white community. I've done a lot of traveling. I went to school in DC, and it was through those experiences that I started to have broadening my view of how we move through the world and how we move through the world differently. I put two big markers of my biases and where they come from. I grew up in a very strict military Catholic family. And so a lot of some of the intentional and unintentional messaging I got as a young person, has carried throughout my life. And I had become more and more aware of those biases, but they still have a huge impact on how I see the world. And I'm working on that. I have UConn here because I'm finishing up my doctorate program at NEAG. The focus of my research is on the reluctance of white teachers to discuss race in the classroom with their students and the impact that has on the student achievement. And then just to throw out some of my street credibility here, I was a teacher for 16 years. I taught primarily middle school, some high school. I then went over to the dark side and became an administrator. I tout myself as a curriculum expert, whether it's UDL or UBD. Over the last few years, I have done more and more work in the equity space, and I work with districts and towns in order to help craft and implement equity plans. And then I am the diversity trainer for the Connecticut General Assembly. So that's what I put out there as my street cred. And again, you'll see that my email is everywhere, because I do hope you will reach out if you have any questions or would like to share any information. So the first group I'm going to send you off into is to have this conversation briefly. Where is your district or school in the process of ensuring equity in education? And then thinking about what is already in the hopper, what's already in progress, what are your next steps? All right, we'll give you about 7 minutes to have that conversation. Let me unshare because there it is. Nope. Boom. All right. So again, you're going to discuss where you are in equity planning and then what's next. What's the next step in equity planning? Oh, I don't have breakout room power, people. I don't.
It's okay. I'm ready to do it. You said 7 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes, please.
And just to let everybody know, when you're in the breakout rooms, we will not be recording because we can't do that. So you can have your honest, open conversations. And the other thing is, if you need help, there's a help button and one of us will be there to help you. So have fun.
All right, welcome back. I'd like to hear what people's next steps are in your planning, if anyone wants to share with the big group, or it could be anything you noticed while speaking with each other. What's the next step?
I'll jump in. I'll jump in for the sake of conversation.
Thank you.
And I'll speak with Mary, who's a colleague of mine on our equity team. And we've done a lot of adult learning and a lot of adult reflecting, and we're at a point now, and Mary's word that's going to stick with me throughout the session is confidence. We have a bit more confidence now to translate this into the hands of students. And as a school, we have had to do a lot of work making sure that we are intentional in what we do before we act. And so our next steps would be moving the adult learning into student learning in a strategic manner.
Great. Thank you. Yes, Evie.
Yeah, so I think all three of us expressed a bit of frustration, right? And I think, speaking for myself, I'd say, like, in my district, we can check all of the boxes for all of the strategies, from policy to conversations on race to pedagogy, culturally relevant pedagogy, and all the books. You name a book, we have it, we read it, we did it, right? So, this next phase, like, I'm really focused on what are the measures that we need, not the checklist of things that we've done or said we read or conversations we had, but what are the true measures that we're moving the dial?
Right.
And that's about student outcomes, right? Glenn Singleton's group talks about equity vital signs, which is a really interesting concept, and redefining those measures.
Great, thank you. All right. So I want to just go over some definitions quickly, so that we do know what we're talking about when we're kind of looking at DEI and racism and anti-racism. So I have these written in here specifically because, as I said, I'm going to give you access to this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I want to kind of lay down some definitions for what we're talking about. When we're talking about diversity, we're really thinking about numbers and representation, just kind of who is there. And it can be any of the marginalized, different multiple perspectives. So it is nothing more than that, which is why when we talk about DEI, the diversity, well, in order to get to inclusion and equity, you have to have people at the table. But diversity in and of itself is really just numbers and looking at the representation, not necessarily looking at the involvement of those individuals. When we move to inclusion, now we're talking about not just having a seat at the table, but having a voice at the table, and not just having a voice, but having a voice that's listened to, that's heeded, and that's viewed as valuable. So it is a step, 2 steps beyond diversity. It is the feeling of belonging and some of the sharing of decision-making and some of the power. And then equity is promoting justice, impartiality, and fairness within all of the systems. And so when we're thinking about schools, and again, I can use Waterford. I too can shout out Waterford as they can shout out me, because they are working on infusing equity at every level. They're looking at student handbooks, they're looking at curriculum, they're working with the board, policies, procedures. They are doing a very deep dive and a comprehensive dive into how can they make their district more equitable. So DEI, when we think about these positions or programs, the difference, right, between DEI and anti-racism is DEI is looking at all marginalized communities and trying to create an equitable space for everybody, which is a good thing. As I talk about the danger of DEI to anti-racism, it's not that this is bad, but it opens the door to some misuse of funds and commitment and an opportunity to divert attention away from what's truly important in the education space. When I talk about racism, what I am talking about is systemic racism, is systemic anti-Black, anti-person of color racism. It can be seen as much broader than that, but when I talk about centering race, it'll become clear as to why for this presentation and in general in American education, we're looking at the anti-Black, anti-person of color racism. The fact that we're talking about institutions and systems rather than individuals, that's the space that we're in here. And then what is anti-racism is it's an active process, right? It's not good enough to simply notice a racist policy and eliminate a racist policy, but to remediate that racist policy. All right, we've done this for years. That has created a debt, and we're going to talk about education debt later, but that's created a debt. How do we ameliorate that? How can we mitigate that moving forward? So, oops, I didn't do it. I'm going to look at I always forget to share sound. There it is. So I'm going to show you a real quick clip that just so that you don't have to listen to me the whole time, but you can hear someone else talking about why start with race. And then I'll jump back in.
We often get the question, why start with race? The reason we start with race is that in every system, whereas the education system, criminal justice system, the finance system, every system that you can think of, the disproportionality is starkly revealed in race. And so that's where we start. And that is not to say that there are not other disparities around gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, not at all. But what we're saying is that if you start with race, that you're going to capture so many of those, just the intersectionality of them. And so the numbers lead us to race. And not only do the numbers lead us to starting with race, this country leads us to starting with race. Race is that third rail that no one wants to touch, but we have to touch that rail if we are to get to a more equitable, a more fair and just society.
So when we look at all of the data, and this is, I will have conversations with family members who are not necessarily in this space. And all right, more, I'm talking about my father. So my father will say, well, yeah, of course there's a achievement gap. If you compare the Hartford schools to Simsbury schools, of course you're going to see a gap. It's because the schools aren't as great. And the response to that is, well, if you go into Simsbury and you look at students who are white versus their non-white counterparts, the white students in every category are achieving better. When we look at special education, socioeconomic status, and any way we disaggregate that data, there is still a discrepancy between white students and their non-white, or students of color and their white counterparts. And so maintaining focus on race is still important, even as we are moving in other areas as well. And I think one area that we see it is students with language differences, all right, which is has a huge impact. If anything we haven't figured out how to even the playing field for students whose heritage language is other than English. One of the things that I'm going to talk about is how if we serve students of color, it will benefit all marginalized students. So I just wanted to throw out some key points from a Brookings study about racial disparities in education. The whole study is linked in the document I'm going to share with you. But again, we see that school readiness gaps are improving, except for Black students. Misbehavior in school can pay off for white but not Black students. If you look at the data about referrals for things that are what we think of as insubordination, or not physical aggressive, but aggressive behavior. And then you look 20 years down the line, you see that the white students who receive those kinds of referrals are actually doing well. Can be interpreted as leadership, can be interpreted as strength, but that's not the case for Black students. And I'm sure someone else is talking at length about the school to prison pipeline, but this would be an example of an impact there. We know that the student-teacher racial mismatch harms Black students soon, if not already, and I think we're behind in Connecticut, but the percentage of non-white students in our schools will be over 50%. And in Connecticut, we're still at 90% of teachers being white. And there's all kinds of data and research to show the impact that has. The most common research that's cited is the fact that students will meet the expectations that their teachers set, and that white teachers have lower expectations for their Black students than they do for white students. I think we know this, that white and Asian students are more likely to be exposed to advanced classes. A lot of districts, a lot of high schools still have gatekeepers that keep students of color from taking AP classes because of whatever prerequisites they put in place, which is the example of having a racist policy that may or may not be meant to be racist, but it doesn't matter because the impact is that it's excluding students of color from those advanced classes. And then the gaps are still very pronounced in high school completion rates. And you can look at the numbers of, say, special education students who are not graduating, right? That is a upsetting number as well. But then when you disaggregate and you dig into that, you see that Black students with IEPs have a very low comparatively and actually not comparatively graduation rate. So what I want you to think about, and I think I'm looking at our numbers. I'll send you into breakout rooms for this. Again, I think, let me look at the clock, a quick 7-minute conversation about, so if we take as a good idea centering race, what are some of the obstacles to doing that? Whether it's right now, because there are certainly some that have come up recently, or just in general. What are obstacles to centering race in the striving for equity in education? So Rosie will send you off into breakout rooms for about 7 minutes, and we'll come back and share. Oh, hi, Ann.
Okay, we're ready to go.
All right, so actually I am going to, I'm going to hit pause for the share out, but then when I start presenting again, I'll kick it on again. A couple of things as to, again, centering race. In order to have any kind of impact, we had to be focused and specific when dealing with equity work, because different policy changes will benefit different marginalized groups. And so you have to be very focused on what the task at hand is. Race is that, as that video said, right? It is, when it comes to the United States and the United States educational system, you know, it was set up, right, for middle class white males. And we still live in the vestiges of that system. The other thing that addressing race will do is that it is often an issue that keeps various marginalized groups from effectively coming together. One example is the women's rights movement to get the 20th Amendment and get to the right to vote, that the Black organizations of Black women were not allowed to participate in the marches. And that came from within the system of, you know, Susan B. Anthony's group, that it was said, okay, we're going to have this parade, but you can't have the Black women there. If you look at Black Lives Matter, it was started by women, and it is often considered being co-opted or not co-opted or not welcoming, or, you know, there's so many different intersectionalities that the powers use race to prevent the marginalized communities from coming together. You know, there are fewer white people than there are everybody else. And as long as different marginalized groups don't get together, there's a majority of white males. And then as we deepen our ability to eliminate racial inequity, and again, it doesn't say as we eliminate racial, it's a huge process that we may or may never be able to get to. But as we do that, and we learn how to use a racial lens when looking at policies and when looking at pedagogy and curricula, then we'll be better equipped to move to other marginalized groups. Gloria Ladson-Billings, and I'm not going to do her justice in her idea of education debt, but this is, to me, everything rolled up in a nutshell as to why we need to center race. Rather than think of the achievement gap, Gloria Ladson-Billings refers to it as the education debt, because the lack of investment in communities of color, schools that primarily serve kids of color, that deficit has grown over time and has accumulated to the point where there is a huge debt owed to kids, but to people of color in general in this country. She came to this idea by watching the Times Square national debt clock. And one of the reasons why she kind of latched onto it was because it also shows what your family share is, right? This debt, this education debt that is owed to people of color is everyone's responsibility. And again, it comes from the centuries of a lack of investment in communities. So when I think of DEI and anti-racism and why they are not compatible, which isn't exactly, let me put it this way, why DEI is a potential danger to anti-racism. And just going back to the definitions, which clearly says that the goal of DEI is to serve all marginalized groups, right? And to kind of create that world for all marginalized groups. A lot of times people will use the term, well, a rising tide lifts all boats. If we can create equitable policies for everyone, then we will see a lift towards equality for everyone. And I too have used this phrase years ago, and then it kind of became clear to me that the reason why this is not a good concept, and I think that this kind of represents what DEI is, an idea of making things better for everyone benefits everyone. The problem is that some people have a super yacht and some people have a dinghy. So you may, a rising tide may lift both of these boats, but it's not any way addressing the inequity that already exists. And so the anti-racism is really going in and remediating some of the policies, procedures, and sins that have been committed over the years, so that we can get everybody in a good boat and then go ahead and raise the tide. But just raising the tide isn't going to help everybody if you're not already in a seaworthy boat. So really what the huge potential negative impact of DEI is that it can dilute the commitment to eliminating that education debt. That instead of focusing on where the need is due to past policy, that we find ways around it. We find ways to get around being anti-racist. So let me just throw in real quick, because when we talk about obstacles, right, there is a push and pull around white people being willing to get on board with centering race, right? And so there are people, some of whom are not pure of heart or have malice, but some of whom do not necessarily have malice, but are going to kind of gum up the works for that to deal with and to address that education debt. Because one way that white people avoid talking about race is by diverting the conversation to another ism. So what is very possible and what has happened, and I will give a couple of examples, is that if we don't call a thing, if we don't explicitly say we're talking about anti-racism, or we're talking about race, or we are centering race, then what could very well happen is what happened with affirmative action, right? Where businesses and schools were given a list of marginalized people, and they had the ability to, oh, I can check this box off and it counts towards my affirmative action. So as most of you probably know, the group that benefited most from affirmative action is white women. So we saw if there was a Black man and a white woman going for the same job or the same place, position, whatever, the people were more comfortable hiring a white woman than a Black man. And so affirmative action showed it did wonders for white women, but it didn't have the impact on all marginalized communities. It did not have that kind of impact on communities of color. And then I also wanted to kind of share a concrete example of how these resources can be diverted with seemingly really good intent, but that the impact is the same in that it takes money away from what the real issue is. You know, nationwide, we're working on diversifying the teaching cadre, right? What Connecticut is at about 90% of teachers are white. Nationwide, it's in the 80s. And so most states have different programs or grants in order to do something to diversify the teaching cadre. The way it is written in Connecticut is it's called minority teacher recruitment. And so if you dig in, it's very clear we're talking about teachers of color, but there's a danger there of money being diverted for other minorities. And it has been the case in at least one district that they wanted to use the money to go to more LGBTQIA recruitment. And as a member of that community, I thank you, but we're not disproportionately represented in the teaching cadre, right? The research shows that we need to get teachers of color in front of our kids, in front of all of our kids. And so there's a great example of how by not naming something with race as the center goal, with anti-racism as the goal, that it's possible for that to be diverted, whether it's the commitment, the resources, the time. If we don't call a thing, there's a real danger of that money or research being diverted. So when we think of what are high leverage points with a district, what do I do? You know, number one is you need to dig into the data. I have worked with a couple of districts where their subgroups are so small, they're not reported out. And so it's hard for an outsider to go in and dig into the data. But you all have that access to dig into the achievement data, the discipline data, and the attendance and engagement data, and notice where the discrepancies are, where there's a disproportionate representation of students of color, and then address that issue. Look at our hiring practices. I'm working with a number of superintendents right now who are really committed and doing some soul searching and planning to look at the hiring practices and how they are inequitable and how they are impacting their ability to hire more teachers of color. Where in this pipeline is it going awry? Because there are many different points, but that's a whole different discussion. And then finally, culturally relevant pedagogy, bringing in teaching strategies that serve all students. Culturally relevant pedagogy is not a pedagogy that helps students of color. It is a pedagogy that helps all students. And so that's another, in my breakout room, I was talking about, you need to change the words that we use. Look, don't use the term critical race theory. That's fine, right? First of all, no one can define it anyway, so just don't use it. So we talk about culturally relevant pedagogy. You don't have to call it that. You can talk about student-centered pedagogy, student-centered instructional strategies that will help all students have access to the learning. The real key thing to remember is that it's not a marathon. I'm sorry, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Be patient and grind hard every single day. And Joe said something in the breakout room that, I was not able to attend in the morning, and it sounds like I really would have loved Dr. Williams, because one of my concluding statement is you got to play to lose, right? Half measures avail us nothing. That if you aren't willing to do what's right for all of our students because it's what's right, knowing that you're going to lose something. Right? For some people, you're losing money. For some people, you're losing comfort. For some people, you may lose your job. But you have to be willing to do the right thing. You have to be willing to center race, to name it, to say it, and then to deal with the uproar, right? Or as Joe said in our breakout room, like kind of focus on the support, not on the negative comments. So what I want, because not bad timing, not great timing. The last slide here that I'm going to give to you is a bunch of additional resources. This one down here that's misspelled, looking at critical race theory with a communication lens, is a really great resource for you from the National Schools Public Relations Association, something to that effect. But I am going to share all of this with you. I apologize for kind of rushing right now, but I gotta, I'm running out of time. I'm going to put the link to this in the chat. And I am always happy to stick around. I know you have something else at, I think it's at 2. So I'm happy to stick around for 10 minutes if anyone wants to stay and comment or ask questions or anything.
Well, Linda, as you always do, you have planted new seeds in my head, and I can only imagine the seeds in everybody else on here today. We certainly need to be brave and confident as we center race. Linda did share her information. Thank you, Linda, for taking the time to share with us your expertise and help us dive more into this topic, which opened my eyes, as you always do.